Sometimes, the weight of the world doesn't announce itself. It just sits on your chest, quiet and heavy, until you feel like you're suffocating under the pressure of ordinary life. For Leo, that pressure was a constant companion. At 24, his life was a relentless cycle of running from one burning fire to the next. By day, he was a full-time college student trying to finish a degree that felt increasingly out of reach. By night, and during every spare weekend hour, he was a ghost for hire, taking on whatever odd jobs the local community bulletin board threw his way. He mowed lawns until his hands rawed, painted houses until his shoulders screamed, and cleared out flooded basements until the smell of damp earth felt permanently etched into his skin. Every dollar went toward rent, groceries, and the crushing mountain of tuition fees that seemed to grow faster than he could pay them down. He was exhausted, running on caffeine and a stubborn refusal to drown. Right next door to Leo's cramped, drafty apartment building stood the Vance estate. It was a massive, historic mansion that looked like a relic from another century, surrounded by wrought iron fences and ancient oak trees that cast long, twisting shadows across the neighborhood. The house was beautiful, but it possessed a melancholy air, a structural monument to isolation. It belonged to Mrs. Evelyn Vance. At 68, she was a woman of striking elegance. She moved with a quiet dignity, her silver hair always perfectly pinned, her voice soft but carrying the undeniable weight of old money and deep refinement. She was a widow, living entirely alone in that sprawling fortress of memories. Leo had seen her occasionally over the past year, tending to her roses or standing on the grand porch, looking out at the world with an expression he could never quite decipher. She was polite, always offering a gentle nod, but she kept her distance. That changed on a humid Tuesday afternoon. Leo was sitting on his porch steps, staring blankly at a spreadsheet of his mounting expenses, when he heard the heavy iron gate of the Vance estate creak open. He looked up to see Mrs. Vance walking down her stone path, a focused look on her face. She stopped at the edge of his yard, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that caught him off guard. She didn't offer her usual distant smile. Instead, she looked at him with a strange, searching gaze, as if she were trying to read a message written in the lines of his face. She asked if he had any availability that afternoon. She explained that she needed help with a task she had put off for far too long. She needed someone strong, someone she could trust, to help her clean out her massive, dusty attic. She offered a payment that made Leo's heart skip a beat, an amount that would cover his rent for the next 3 months. He didn't hesitate. He closed his laptop, stood up, and followed her into the shadow of the great mansion. The interior of the Vance estate was like a museum frozen in time. The air smelled of polished mahogany, old paper, and a faint trace of lavender. As Leo followed Mrs. Vance up the grand, winding staircase, the opulence of the lower floors began to give way to something more somber. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, but as they climbed higher, the decorations thinned. Finally, they reached the highest landing, where a heavy, reinforced wooden door stood. Mrs. Vance produced an old brass key from her pocket, her fingers trembling slightly as she inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a heavy, metallic click that echoed down the stairwell. She pushed the door open, revealing a steep, narrow set of wooden steps that vanished into the darkness above. She pulled a chain, and a single, low-wattage bulb flickered to life, casting a dim, amber glow over the entrance to the attic. She turned to Leo, her expression unreadable, and told him the attic hadn't been thoroughly cleared in over 30 years. She asked him to bring down the heavy trunks, sort the old furniture, and stack the boxes near the stairs. Then, she stepped back, leaving him to ascend into the heat and dust alone. The attic was massive, stretching across the entire expanse of the house. It was a labyrinth of forgotten lives. Dust motes danced like ghosts in the narrow beams of sunlight that managed to pierce through the small, circular dormer windows. The air was thick, heavy with the suffocating heat of midsummer, making it hard to breathe. Everywhere Leo looked, there were stacks of old paintings, shrouded in white sheets like spirits, crates of antique porcelain, and mountains of cardboard boxes taped shut decades ago. Leo rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He started moving the lighter boxes first, organizing them by size. The silence up there was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic scuff of his sneakers on the floorboards and the distant, muffled sounds of the street below. But as the hours wore on, an uncomfortable sensation began to settle in his gut. The atmosphere felt increasingly tense, thick with an unspoken gravity. It felt less like a storage room and more like a tomb holding secrets that didn't want to be disturbed. By the third hour, sweat was dripping down Leo's face, and his shirt was damp. He had cleared a significant path through the center of the room, exposing the raw, dark wood of the floorboards. That was when he noticed something unusual near the far eave of the roof, hidden behind a towering, heavy oak wardrobe that looked like it hadn't been moved in half a century. Using all his strength, Leo pushed the wardrobe aside, the wood groaning against the floor. Tucked into a recessed alcove behind it, completely shielded from view, sat a vintage wooden chest. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. Made of dark, weathered cherry wood, it was bound by tarnished iron straps and secured with a heavy, intricate lock. Unlike the other items in the attic, which were covered in a uniform layer of gray dust, this chest had a clean surface, as if someone had visited it, touched it, perhaps even wept over it, far more recently than 30 years ago. Leo knelt in the dust before the chest. His heart began to beat a little faster, driven by a sudden, inexplicable surge of adrenaline. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold iron of the lock. To his surprise, the lock wasn't fully engaged, it was just hanging loose, the latch resting in the loop. Someone had left it open. He took a deep breath, the scent of aged cedar hitting his nose as he slowly lifted the heavy lid. The hinges didn't creak, they had been oiled. Inside, the chest was lined with faded blue velvet. At first glance, it contained what looked like standard memorabilia, an old wool blanket, a collection of vintage poetry books, and a stack of letters tied together with a fraying silk ribbon. But it was what lay beneath the letters that made Leo's breath catch in his throat. He reached into the chest and pulled out a stack of old, matte-finish photographs. He turned the first one over. The image was clear, despite the passage of time. It showed a young woman, instantly recognizable as a youthful Mrs. Vance, laughing as she stood by a lake. But it was the man standing next to her, his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, that made the world around Leo tilt. The man was young, handsome, with a bright, carefree smile and a distinct cowlick in his dark hair. It was a face Leo knew intimately. It was a face he had stared at in framed pictures on his mother's mantel for as long as he could remember. It was his father. His late father, Michael, who had passed away when Leo was just a boy. Leo's hands began to shake violently. He dropped the first photo onto his lap and quickly flipped through the rest. There were dozens of them. His father and Mrs. Vance holding hands in a crowded park. His father kissing her cheek beneath a street lamp. His father writing at a wooden desk, looking up at the camera with pure devotion in his eyes. These weren't casual snapshots, they were the chronicling of a deep, passionate, and hidden love story. Leo felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. His father had never mentioned Mrs. Vance. His mother had never spoken of her. To Leo's knowledge, his father had been an ordinary, working-class man who had lived a quiet life. What was he doing here, in the private, sacred archives of the wealthiest woman in the neighborhood? With a racing heart, Leo reached back into the chest, his fingers brushing against a thick, legal-sized envelope resting at the very bottom. He pulled it out. The paper was heavy, expensive parchment, bearing the embossed seal of a prominent local law firm. He opened the envelope and pulled out a signed legal document dated just a few years prior. As his eyes scanned the text, the air left his lungs completely. The document was a trust agreement for an anonymous educational scholarship. It detailed the exact financial structure that had been funding Leo's entire college tuition for the past 4 years. Leo had always believed he had won a highly competitive, blind selection merit scholarship from a private foundation, a miracle that had been the only reason he could afford to pursue his dreams. But the document in his hands laid out a devastatingly different reality. The sole benefactor of that foundation, the person who had quietly, invisibly paid every single cent of his tuition, fees, and textbooks, was Mrs. Evelyn Vance. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. He sat there, paralyzed in the dust of the attic, surrounded by the ghosts of his father's past, holding the proof that his entire life had been covertly financed by the enigmatic woman downstairs. Why? Why would she spend tens of thousands of dollars on a neighbor's son? What hold did his father have over her? The questions swirled in his mind, loud and deafening, crashing against each other until he felt dizzy. Just as Leo held the photos in disbelief, staring at the legal signatures that connected his fractured reality, a sudden, heavy sound shattered the silence of the attic. Thud, it was the unmistakable, deep sound of the thick attic door shutting tightly at the bottom of the stairs. A second later, a sharp, metallic ring echoed up the stairwell, the sound of the heavy brass key turning in the lock, followed by the slide of a deadbolt. The door had been locked from the outside. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped the papers and stood up, his instincts screaming at him to move. He took a step toward the stairs, but stopped dead in his tracks. He heard it. The slow, rhythmic, deliberate sound of footsteps ascending the narrow wooden steps. Asterisk creak. Creak. Creak, asterisk each step felt agonizingly heavy, vibrating through the floorboards and straight into Leo's chest. The ambient heat of the attic suddenly felt suffocating, trapping the air in his throat. The shadow appeared first, elongated and distorted by the amber light bulb, casting itself across the dusty floor. Then, she stepped into the attic. Mrs. Vance stood at the top of the stairs. She wasn't wearing her usual gentle expression. Her posture was rigid, her face pale, and her eyes were fixed entirely on Leo. More specifically, they were fixed on the photographs and the legal documents scattered at his feet. She looked at him with a volatile mix of deep, agonizing sorrow and fierce, unbreakable determination. She reached behind her, checking the lock on the internal latch, ensuring they were entirely isolated from the rest of the world. Then, she looked up, her gaze locking onto Leo's trembling frame. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, before she finally spoke. Her voice was lower than usual, carrying a chilling, undeniable authority. "I know what you did, Leo," she said, her voice trembling but steadying as she took a step forward. "And you are not leaving this room until you hear the whole truth." Leo swallowed hard, his voice caught in his throat. He backed up a step until his calves hit the vintage chest. "Mrs. Vance. I don't understand," he stammered, gesturing wildly toward the floor. "My father, you knew him? And this document, the scholarship, it was you? Why? What is this?" Mrs. Vance closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply as if gathering the strength to unearth a weight she had carried for half a lifetime. When she opened them, the coldness in her gaze thawed, replaced by a profound, raw vulnerability that made her look fragile despite her commanding presence. She walked slowly over to a pair of old, dust-covered armchairs, pulling the white sheet off one of them, sending a cloud of dust swirling into the air. She sat down, her hands resting on her knees, and looked at Leo with an expression of pure heartbreak. "Sit down, Leo," she said softly, gesturing to the crate across from her. "Please. Your legs are shaking, and what I have to tell you requires you to stand firmly on the ground, even if the ground is about to shift beneath your feet." Leo, unable to process his own fear and confusion, sank slowly onto the wooden crate. He kept the photograph of his father tightly gripped in his right hand. 35 years ago, Mrs. Vance began, her eyes drifting toward the small circular window, looking at a past only she could see. This house wasn't a prison. It was a home, though a strict one. My family, the Vances, held immense power and wealth in this valley. We were expected to marry within our social circle, to maintain the lineage, the business, the prestige. But I was young, and I was rebellious. And then, I met Michael. She paused, her eyes dropping to the photo in Leo's hand. A soft, melancholic smile brushed her lips. Your father was the most extraordinary man I had ever met. He didn't have a dime to his name. He was working as a simple landscaper, hired by my father to tend to the vast gardens of this very estate. He was kind, incredibly intelligent, and he possessed a spark of life that this dead house desperately lacked. We started talking over the rose bushes. Private conversations turned into secret meetings. Before either of us realized what was happening, we fell deeply, hopelessly in love. Leo listened, spellbound, the anger and panic fading into a surreal fascination. But if you loved him, why did he leave? Why did he marry my mother? Mrs. Vance let out a long, shuddering breath. Because the world is a cruel place for people who try to break its rules. Our romance didn't stay a secret for long. My father found out. The fury of the Vance family was absolute. My father threatened to destroy Michael. He had connections everywhere, the banks, the police, the local employers. He told Michael that if he didn't disappear, if he didn't leave me, he would ensure Michael's family lost their home, that Michael would never find a job in this state again, and that he would spend the rest of his life in ruin. Michael wasn't afraid for himself, Leo. He was a brave man. But he loved his parents, and he loved me too much to let my family destroy his life. She stood up, pacing the small cleared area of the attic, her silver hair catching the dim light. Michael came to me one last time, right here in this attic. It was the only place we could hide inside the house. He told me we had to stop. I begged him to run away with me. I told him I would give up the inheritance, the money, the family name, everything. But Michael was wiser than I was. He knew that a life spent on the run, hunted by bitter, powerful people, would eventually poison the love we had. He made me promise to stay, to protect myself, and to live the life I was meant to live. He sacrificed his own happiness to keep me safe from my own family's wrath. A few months later, my father forced me into an arranged marriage with Richard Vance, a distant cousin, to solidify the family estate. Michael moved away, met your mother, and built a modest, quiet life. But we made a pact before we parted. A sacred vow. What vow? Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper. We promised that if either of us ever needed help, if the universe ever brought our bloodlines back together, we would do whatever it took to protect each other's future, Mrs. Vance said, turning to face him. I lived a long, empty life with Richard. We had no children. He passed away 10 years ago, leaving me with this massive fortune, this empty house, and a heart full of regrets. And then, 5 years ago, I heard about Michael's passing. It broke me, Leo. The man I loved was gone, and I never got to tell him that I never stopped thinking about him. She walked back over to Leo, kneeling down so she was at eye level with him. Shortly after his death, I started looking into his family. I found out about you. I saw that Michael had a son who possessed his exact eyes, his relentless work ethic, and his brilliant mind. But I also saw that you were drowning. You were working yourself to the bone, trying to pay for a college education that your family couldn't afford. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't give Michael his dreams back, but I could damn well make sure his son got theirs. I set up the Anonymous Foundation. I funded your tuition. It wasn't charity, Leo. It was a debt. A debt of love and honor that I owed to the only man who ever truly loved me for who I was. Leo stared at her, tears finally spilling over his eyelids, tracing lines through the dust on his cheeks. The resentment, the confusion, the fear of being locked in, it all evaporated, replaced by a profound, aching empathy. He looked at the photographs of his father, realizing that the anonymous blessing that had kept him afloat during his darkest semesters wasn't a random stroke of luck. It was the enduring echo of his father's first love, reaching across decades to rescue him. But why the secrecy today? Leo asked, wiping his eyes. Why did you lock the door? Why did you say you knew what I did? Mrs. Vance let out a soft, self-deprecating laugh, the tension completely leaving her shoulders. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, old-fashioned key, holding it up. Because, Leo, I knew that if you found that chest, which I purposely left accessible to you today, you would see the truth. And I know you. You are exactly like Michael. You are proud, fiercely independent, and stubborn to a fault. If I had just sat you downstairs and told you this, you would have denied the money, you would have walked out, you would have felt compromised. I locked the door because I needed you to listen. Truly listen, without running away, without letting your pride dictate your reaction. I needed you to understand the depth of history before you made a choice. She reached down, taking the legal document from Leo's hand, and turned to the final page, which Leo hadn't yet read. And there is one more thing you need to know. The scholarship was only the beginning. Leo frowned, looking down at the page she was pointing to. What do you mean? When my father forced Michael and me apart, Michael didn't just walk away with nothing, Mrs. Vance explained, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, emotional whisper. Before he left, he gave me a small amount of money, everything he had saved from his landscaping work. It was barely a few $100s. He told me to invest it, to keep it secret from my family, and to let it grow as a symbol of what we could have built together. He called it our Hope Fund. Over the last 30 years, I didn't just leave that money in a bank. I invested it aggressively, using my family's financial advisors, shielding it entirely from the Vance estate. I treated it as a sacred trust, a living piece of Michael that grew alongside my fortune. She tapped the bottom of the document, where a bank routing number and an account balance were printed in stark, black ink. Leo's eyes adjusted to the numbers, counting the digits, his brain struggling to comprehend the scale of what he was seeing. The balance wasn't thousands. It wasn't even tens of thousands. The account held a staggering, life-altering sum of over $2 million. This money doesn't belong to the Vance estate, Mrs. Vance said, her eyes shining with tears. Legally, ethically, and spiritually, it belongs to Michael's heir. It belongs to you, Leo. This is the hidden inheritance your father left behind, grown from the seeds of his labor and nurtured by the love we shared. It was legally locked into a trust that matures on your 25th birthday, which is just next month. I brought you up here today to find it, because I am getting older, Leo. My health is failing, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving this world without fulfilling my final promise to your father. Leo sat there, completely stunned. The world around him went entirely quiet. The crushing weight that had sat on his chest for years, the anxiety over next month's rent, the fear of failing his future, the exhaustion of working until his bones ached, suddenly lifted, dissolving into the warm attic air. He wasn't just free from debt, he was looking at a future of absolute security, a gift forged in secret 3 decades ago by a father who had loved him and a woman who had never forgotten that love. Mrs. Vance stood up, stepping over to the attic stairs. She unlocked the heavy door with a gentle turn of the key and pushed it wide open, letting a fresh, cool breeze from the lower floors sweep into the stifling room. She turned back to Leo, her smile warm, radiant, and peaceful. "The doors are open, Leo," she said softly. "You are free to go. You can walk out of here right now, or you can come downstairs, let me make you a cup of tea, and we can talk about the man who connects us both. The choice is yours." Leo looked down at the photograph of his father, smiling up at him from a lifetime ago. Then, he looked up at Mrs. Vance, the woman who had quietly guarded his life from the shadows. He stood up, carefully placed the photographs and the documents back into the velvet-lined chest, and closed the lid. He walked toward the stairs, a genuine, tearful smile breaking across his face. He didn't walk past her to leave. Instead, he offered her his arm, and together, they stepped out of the dark attic and down into the light.